What if I told you that the last time a millionaire saw his pregnant wife, she was smiling at him from their penthouse doorway, and 9 months later, she would return to destroy his entire empire? This is the true story of Madison Cross, a woman who discovered her tech mogul husband's shocking betrayal and made a decision that would change everything. She didn't just disappear, she vanished so completely that even the FBI couldn't find her. But when she returned, she wasn't the helpless victim her husband expected. She was something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. What happened during those 9 months will leave you speechless, and her final revenge. It's so brilliant, so perfectly executed, that it became a masterclass in justice. But before we dive into this incredible tale of betrayal, survival, and ultimate triumph, I need you to do one thing. Madison's story proves that sometimes the greatest strength comes from our darkest moments. If this incredible journey of courage and justice moved you, show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps more people discover these powerful stories. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Madison's situation? Would you have had the courage to disappear and rebuild your entire life? And hey, if you're new here and you love stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We share amazing true stories like this every week, tales of triumph, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, remember, you're stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and capable of more than you ever imagined. See you in the next one. Madison Cross stood in the marble foyer of her $20 million prison, one hand resting on her 8-month pregnant belly, the other clutching a credit card statement that made her blood run cold. The Silicon Valley mansion stretched around her like a museum of her former life, all glass walls and designer furniture that she'd once thought represented success. "Blake," she called out, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. No answer. Her husband was probably in his home office, preparing for tomorrow's IPO announcement that would make them even wealthier than they already were. Madison had given up her career as an investigative journalist 3 years ago when Blake Sullivan swept her off her feet with his tech mogul charm and promises of a perfect life. She'd traded her press badge for a wedding ring, her newsroom desk for charity galas and spa appointments. But old habits die hard, and the journalist in her couldn't ignore the red flags scattered throughout their financial records. The credit card charges were small at first. Coffee shops in downtown Palo Alto, where Blake claimed never to go. Restaurant bills for two when he said he was in solo meetings. A monthly payment to something called Metropolitan Suites that Blake had explained away as a business expense. But tonight, the charges had escalated. Jewelry stores, lingerie boutiques, a weekend getaway to Napa that had never appeared on Blake's calendar. "There you are, beautiful." Blake's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, still wearing his $1,000 suit from whatever meeting had kept him out until nearly midnight. Even exhausted, he was devastatingly handsome, with the kind of confident smile that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman alive. "We need to talk," Madison said, holding up the statement. Blake's smile faltered for just a moment before sliding back into place. "Can it wait until tomorrow? The IPO announcement is at 8 a.m., and I need to review my notes." "No, it can't wait." Madison stepped closer, her journalist instinct screaming that she was onto something big. "What's Metropolitan Suites?" "Blake, I told you, it's a business expense. We lease space there for client meetings. $7,000 a month for client meetings." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Madison, you're pregnant and stressed. The doctor said you need to avoid unnecessary anxiety." There it was, the deflection he'd been using for months. Anytime she questioned anything, he blamed her hormones or her pregnancy. But Madison had covered stories about gaslighting and manipulation. She knew the signs. "I want to see this meeting space," she said quietly. "That's not possible. Client confidentiality." Madison studied her husband's face, looking for the tells she'd learned to spot during years of interviewing politicians and CEOs. The slight tension around his eyes, the way his left hand moved to adjust his wedding ring. Classic signs of deception. "Then I'll find it myself." Blake's mask slipped completely. "Madison, you're being paranoid. This isn't healthy for you or the baby." But Madison was already walking away, her mind racing with the same focused determination that had once made her one of the most respected investigative journalists in California. She'd uncovered corruption in City Hall, exposed fraud in Silicon Valley startups, and brought down a human trafficking ring. Whatever Blake was hiding, she would find it. She just had no idea that the truth would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. As she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Madison felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs. Soon, she would be responsible for protecting another life. And if her husband was lying to her about something as simple as office space, what else was he hiding? The journalist in her was fully awake now, and she wouldn't rest until she had answers. Madison spent the sleepless night researching Metropolitan Suites. By dawn, she'd discovered it was an upscale apartment complex in downtown Palo Alto. Not an office building, the kind of place where tech executives kept discreet second homes for affairs or entertaining clients they wanted to keep off the books. Blake left early for his IPO announcement, kissing her forehead and reminding her to rest. The moment his Tesla pulled out of the driveway, Madison was in her car, following the address she'd found online. The 45-minute drive gave her time to think. Every marriage had secrets, she reasoned. Maybe Blake really was using the apartment for business. Maybe she was being paranoid, like he said. But as she pulled into the parking garage of the sleek high-rise building, her gut told her otherwise. "I'm here to see the apartment leased under Sullivan Industries," she told the concierge, using her most authoritative voice. The young man behind the desk hesitated. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Sullivan left specific instructions that only he and Ms. Hayes are authorized visitors." Madison's heart stopped. "Ms. Hayes. Oh." The concierge's face went pale. "I shouldn't have. I mean, Scarlett Hayes." Madison pressed, recognizing the name of Blake's business partner, the woman who joined his company 6 months ago as head of strategic development. Before the concierge could answer, Madison was already walking toward the elevator bank, her mind racing. Scarlett Hayes was 26, brilliant, and beautiful in the way that made other women feel invisible. Blake had introduced her as his new business partner, someone who would help take the company to the next level. Madison had even liked her during their brief meeting at a company event. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal. Madison's hands shook as she approached apartment 1512, using the spare key she'd found in Blake's desk drawer, labeled MS Office. She'd thought it meant Microsoft Office. The apartment was exquisite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bay. Expensive furniture filled the open-concept living space. And everywhere Madison looked, she saw evidence of a life she wasn't part of. Women's clothes in the closet, Scarlett's prescription bottles in the bathroom, photos of Blake and Scarlett on vacation in locations Madison had never seen. But the final blow came when she opened Blake's laptop, still logged into his email account. The password was Scarlett's birthday. Madison scrolled through months of correspondence, each message a knife to her heart. Blake and Scarlett weren't just having an affair. They were planning a complete takeover of Madison's life. "The trust fund documentation needs to be finalized before the baby comes," Blake had written to Scarlett 3 weeks ago. "Once Madison gives birth, we can implement phase 2. "Are you sure the psychiatric evaluation will hold up in court?" Scarlett had replied. "We need her declared mentally incompetent before she can contest anything." Madison's hands trembled as she continued reading. They had been planning this for months. Blake had married her not for love, but for access to the $50 million trust fund she'd inherited from her grandmother. A trust fund that would transfer to her child if she died or was declared mentally incompetent. The sound of a key in the lock made Madison's blood freeze. She quickly closed the laptop and looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. Voices approached from the hallway. "The IPO announcement went perfectly," Blake was saying. "By tomorrow, we'll be worth twice what we are today. And Madison," Scarlett's voice was closer now, "still has no idea. The pregnancy has made her so emotional and suspicious. It'll be easy to convince everyone she's having a breakdown." Madison pressed herself against the wall behind the kitchen island, barely breathing as Blake and Scarlett entered the apartment. "I still think we're moving too fast," Scarlett said. "We can't wait much longer. Once the baby comes, the trust fund transfers. If we don't have her declared incompetent before then—" I know. Judge Coleman is already prepared to sign the commitment papers. Your friend Dr. Peterson will provide the psychiatric evaluation. Madison watched in horror as Blake pulled Scarlett into his arms. Soon, this will all be our, he murmured, kissing her neck. Madison will be safely tucked away in a private facility, and we'll have everything. The money, the company, the baby. What about the baby? Scarlett asked. What about it children belong with their father, especially when their mother is mentally ill? Madison had heard enough. She crept toward the door, but her pregnant belly bumped against a side table, sending a vase crashing to the floor. Blake and Scarlett sprang apart. What was that? Scarlett whispered. Madison ran. Madison's hands shook so violently she could barely start her car. She drove aimlessly through Palo Alto's tree-lined streets, her mind reeling from what she'd discovered. Blake didn't love her. He'd never loved her. Their entire marriage was the elaborate con designed to steal her inheritance and take her child. She needed help. She needed proof. She needed someone to believe her. Her first call was to Detective Ray Morgan, her former colleague from her journalism days. Ray had been a source for several of her investigative pieces, and she trusted him more than anyone in law enforcement. Madison, Jesus, it's been what, 3 years? How are you? Ray, I need your help. I think my husband is planning to have me committed so he can steal my trust fund. A long pause. Madison, that's a serious accusation. Are you okay? You sound upset. Even Ray thought she sounded crazy. Madison forced herself to speak more calmly. I have evidence. Financial records, emails, recordings. Can you meet me somewhere private? They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Mountain View, far from anywhere Blake might look for her. Madison spent the drive trying to organize her thoughts, to present the information in a way that would convince Ray she wasn't having a pregnancy-induced breakdown. But when she arrived at the coffee shop, Ray wasn't alone. He was sitting with Dr. David Peterson, the psychiatrist Blake had mentioned in his conversation with Scarlett. Madison's blood turned to ice. Ray had betrayed her. The trap was already closing. Madison, Dr. Peterson said gently as she approached their table. Blake is very worried about you. He says you've been having paranoid thoughts, imagining conspiracies. Ray! Madison looked at her former colleague, pleading with her eyes. You know me. You know I don't make things up. Ray's expression was sympathetic but firm. Madison, you've been under a lot of stress. Pregnancy can trigger psychological episodes. Dr. Peterson just wants to help. Madison realized with crystal clarity that Blake's reach extended further than she'd imagined. How many people were in his pocket? How long had he been planning this? She turned and walked quickly toward the exit, but Dr. Peterson followed her. Madison, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Blake has already started the involuntary commitment process. You can come willingly, or the police can escort you. Either way, you're getting the help you need. Madison broke into a run, her pregnant belly making her awkward and slow. Behind her, she heard Dr. Peterson on his phone, probably calling Blake or the authorities. She made it to her car and locked the doors, her heart pounding. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. Sweetheart, Ray called me. He's worried about you. Come home so we can talk. I love you. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced. If Madison hadn't heard Blake's real conversation with Scarlett, she might have believed his concerned husband act. She drove to the nearest bank and withdrew $10,000 in cash from her personal account. If Blake was monitoring her credit cards and bank accounts, she needed to go off-grid immediately. Her phone rang constantly as she drove. Blake, Dr. Peterson, numbers she didn't recognize. She turned it off and removed the battery, a trick she'd learned from sources who needed to disappear. By evening, Madison was checked into a motel under a fake name, paying cash and avoiding security cameras. She used the motel's Wi-Fi to research involuntary psychiatric commitments in California. What she learned terrified her. With the right connections and documentation, Blake could have her committed for up to 72 hours for evaluation. If Dr. Peterson declared her mentally ill, the hold could be extended indefinitely. Once she was in the system, fighting her way out would be nearly impossible, especially while pregnant. Madison spent the night documenting everything she knew. She wrote down dates, times, conversations, financial records. If something happened to her, maybe someone would eventually piece together the truth. At dawn, her worst fears materialized. Through the motel room window, she saw police cars pulling into the parking lot. Someone had tracked her down. Madison grabbed her notes and the cash, slipped out the bathroom window, and disappeared into the California morning. The hunt had begun. Madison's freedom lasted exactly 18 hours. She was captured at a gas station in Fremont, apparently identified by facial recognition software from security cameras. The police officers who arrested her were professional but firm, treating her like a mentally ill person who needed medical attention rather than a fugitive. "Mrs. Sullivan, your husband is very worried about you," Officer Martinez said as she sat in the back of the patrol car. "You've been missing for 2 days. He says you've been having episodes." "I'm not having episodes," Madison said, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm investigating my husband's plan to steal my inheritance. He's been having an affair with his business partner, and they're planning to have me declared mentally incompetent." Officer Martinez exchanged a look with her partner through the rearview mirror. The look that said, "Yep, definitely crazy." Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital was a private facility that looked more like a luxury resort than a mental health institution. Manicured lawns, fountains, buildings designed to soothe rather than intimidate. The kind of place where wealthy families quietly tucked away their embarrassing relatives. Dr. Peterson was waiting for her in the admissions office, along with Blake, who rushed forward with perfectly performed concern. "Madison, thank God you're safe," he said, reaching for her hands. "I was so scared something had happened to you and the baby." Madison jerked away from his touch. "Don't touch me. I know what you're doing. I heard you and Scarlett planning this." Dr. Peterson made a note on his clipboard. "Madison, Scarlett is very concerned about you too. She says you accused her of having an affair with Blake, which is clearly a paranoid delusion." "It's not a delusion. I saw them together. I read their emails." "What emails?" Blake asked gently. "Madison, I've shown Dr. Peterson our email accounts. There's nothing there." Of course. Blake would have deleted everything after discovering Madison had been in the apartment. Or maybe he'd moved their correspondence to accounts Madison couldn't access. Either way, she had no proof. The psychiatric evaluation took 3 hours. Dr. Peterson asked questions designed to make her sound paranoid and delusional. When Madison tried to explain the financial evidence, he dismissed it as pregnancy-related anxiety about money. When she described the apartment, he suggested she'd misinterpreted what she'd seen. Pregnant women often experience heightened emotions and paranoid thoughts, Dr. Peterson explained to Blake, speaking about Madison as if she weren't in the room. "Combined with the stress of your business expansion, it's triggered a temporary psychotic episode." "Is the baby safe?" Blake asked, his voice full of false concern. "The pregnancy appears normal, but Madison needs immediate treatment. I'm recommending a 72-hour hold for evaluation, possibly extending to inpatient treatment until after the birth." Madison's world collapsed. She was trapped in a system designed to help people, being used as a weapon against her. Every protest she made would be seen as proof of her mental illness. Every piece of evidence she provided would be dismissed as delusion. "I want to call a lawyer," she said. "Of course," Dr. Peterson replied. "But first, let's get you settled in your room. You need rest." The room was a cell with soft walls and furniture bolted to the floor. Madison sat on the narrow bed, one hand on her belly, thinking furiously. Blake had planned this perfectly. He'd isolated her from her friends during their marriage, encouraging her to focus on their life together rather than maintaining outside relationships. Her family lived across the country and barely knew Blake. Who would believe her story? But Madison hadn't spent years as an investigative journalist without learning how to think strategically. If Blake wanted to play this game, she would play it better. That night, she met Dr. Elena Vasquez, a staff psychiatrist who worked the overnight shift. Dr. Vasquez was different from Dr. Peterson, asking probing questions that suggested she might actually be listening. "Tell me about your journalism career," Dr. Vasquez said during their session. Madison was cautious at first, but something in the doctor's manner encouraged her to open up. She talked about her investigations, her methods, her instincts for detecting deception. "These skills don't disappear during pregnancy," Dr. Vasquez observed. "If anything, The protective instincts would be heightened. For the first time in days, Madison felt like someone might believe her. Dr. Vasquez, I know how this sounds, but I'm not paranoid. I'm a trained investigator who uncovered a conspiracy against me. My husband is trying to steal my inheritance and take my child. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. Madison, what would you say if I told you that you're not the first woman to be brought here under similar circumstances? Hope flickered in Madison's chest. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes the system meant to protect vulnerable people gets corrupted, and sometimes people like me have to find creative ways to actually protect them. Madison realized she'd found an unlikely ally, but before Dr. Vasquez could explain further, the lights went out, emergency lighting kicked in, and alarms began blaring throughout the facility. What's happening? Madison asked. Dr. Vasquez was already moving toward the door. Your husband just made a very big mistake. The fire alarm wasn't a malfunction. It was Dr. Vasquez's signal to an underground network of professionals who helped women escape abusive situations when the legal system failed them. Madison learned this as she was spirited through a maintenance tunnel beneath Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital, still wearing her hospital gown but carrying a bag of clothes Dr. Vasquez had prepared. We have about 20 minutes before they discover you're missing, Dr. Vasquez said as they emerged into a parking garage 3 blocks away. Blake will claim you had a psychotic break and escaped. Every police officer in the Bay Area will be looking for a dangerous, mentally ill pregnant woman. A van was waiting for them, driven by a woman Madison recognized as one of the hospital's night nurses. Inside were 3 other women, all with stories similar to Madison's. Wealthy husbands who'd used the system against them, children who'd been taken away, fortunes that had been stolen. The network has safe houses throughout California, Dr. Vasquez explained as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness. We'll get you somewhere Blake can't find you, help you give birth safely, and then figure out how to get your life back. Madison should have felt relief, but all she felt was fear. Blake will use this escape as proof that I'm mentally ill. He'll say I'm a danger to my baby. Probably, Dr. Vasquez agreed, but at least you'll be free to fight back. The safe house was a ranch-style home in Mendocino County, surrounded by vineyards and hills. The woman who ran it, Sarah Chen, was a former family court judge who'd lost her position after refusing to go along with corrupt practices. Blake Sullivan, Sarah said when she heard Madison's story. We've been watching him for months. You're not his first victim. Madison felt sick. There have been others, 3 that we know of. Wealthy women who ended up in psychiatric facilities or dead under suspicious circumstances. Blake always emerged with control of their assets. Madison sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Blake's crimes. How is he getting away with this? Money, connections, and a system that's designed to believe men over women? Sarah said bluntly. But you have something the others didn't. What's that? You're a trained investigative journalist. You know how to build a case. For the next 2 weeks, Madison worked around the clock. Despite her advancing pregnancy, she used encrypted computers to research Blake's background, his business dealings, his connections to Dr. Peterson and Judge Coleman. What she discovered was a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of California's legal and medical establishments. Blake had been running variations of this scheme for years. He would identify wealthy women with inheritance or trust funds, seduce them into marriage, then systematically isolate them before triggering a mental health crisis that allowed him to seize control of their assets. Madison also discovered that Blake's company was in serious financial trouble. The IPO he'd announced was built on fraudulent projections. He needed Madison's $50 million trust fund to cover massive debts and avoid criminal charges for securities fraud. But as Madison compiled evidence, Blake was building his own case against her. The escape from Willowbrook had played perfectly into his narrative. Local news stations ran stories about the mentally ill pregnant woman who'd fled psychiatric treatment. Blake gave interviews expressing his concern for his wife and unborn child. Madison is very sick, he told reporters, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. I just want her to get the help she needs before she hurts herself or our baby. The public's sympathy was overwhelming. Blake became the grieving husband whose pregnant wife had vanished into the night. Social media campaigns urged people to report any sightings of the dangerous Madison Sullivan. Madison watched these news reports from the safe house, feeling her options disappearing. Even if she could prove Blake's crimes, who would believe a woman who'd escaped from a psychiatric hospital? "We need to get you out of California," Dr. Vasquez said during one of her visits. "Blake's hired private investigators. It's only a matter of time before they track you here." That night, Madison went into labor. The birth was complicated, happening during a fierce winter storm that knocked out power to the ranch. With no way to get to a hospital safely, Dr. Vasquez and Sarah Chen delivered Madison's son by candlelight, using medical supplies they'd stockpiled for emergencies. When Madison held her baby for the first time, she named him Justice. It was a promise, she decided, justice for herself, for Blake's other victims, and for the son who deserved better than a father who saw him as nothing more than a pathway to stolen money. But even as Madison cradled her newborn son, she knew their safety was temporary. Blake would never stop hunting for them, and the next phase of his plan was already in motion. 3 days after Justice's birth, Sarah Chen burst into Madison's room with devastating news. "Blake's filed papers to have you declared dead," she said. "He's claiming that your mental illness led to suicide, and he's petitioning for custody of the baby as the sole surviving parent." Madison felt the ground shift beneath her. Blake wasn't just trying to control her anymore. He was trying to erase her completely. "How long do we have?" Madison asked. "The hearing is scheduled for next week. If Blake can convince a judge that you're dead, he'll get everything. Your trust fund, legal guardianship of Justice, and complete freedom to disappear with both." Madison looked down at her sleeping son and made a decision that would change everything. Then it's time for Madison Sullivan to really disappear. Madison's plan was audacious and dangerous. If she was going to be declared dead anyway, she would make Blake believe it was true while she built a case to destroy him from the shadows. Working with Dr. Vasquez and the Underground Network, Madison staged her own death with the precision of a military operation. They chose a remote stretch of Highway 1 where the cliffs dropped straight into the Pacific Ocean. Madison's abandoned car was positioned near a guardrail with fresh damage, suggesting she'd driven through it during the storm. Personal effects were scattered at the scene. Madison's wedding ring, found near the cliff edge. Her purse, discovered on the rocks below. Enough evidence to suggest suicide without providing a body that could contradict the story. Dr. Vasquez used her medical connections to create a credible psychological profile supporting the suicide narrative. A pregnant woman suffering from postpartum psychosis, overwhelmed by guilt over her delusions about her loving husband. The news coverage was exactly what Blake needed. "Tragic end to search for missing pregnant woman." Read the headlines. Madison watched the reports from a safe house in Oregon, holding Justice and feeling a strange sense of liberation. Madison Sullivan was dead. Now she could become someone else entirely. Blake's performance at the memorial service was worthy of an Academy Award. He sobbed convincingly as he spoke about losing the love of his life and their unborn child. Scarlett stood beside him, playing the supportive business partner rather than the grieving mistress. "Madison was the brightest light in my world," Blake told the crowd of mourners, most of whom had barely known Madison. "Her illness took her from us, but I'll honor her memory by building the future we dreamed of together." Within a week, Blake had petitioned the court for control of Madison's trust fund as her widower. Judge Coleman, still corrupt and still in Blake's pocket, fast-tracked the proceedings. Blake also announced that he would be taking a leave of absence from his company to grieve, conveniently avoiding the SEC investigation that was about to expose his fraudulent IPO. But Madison wasn't just hiding. She was hunting, using her new identity as Elena Reyes, a freelance journalist. Madison began investigating Blake's network of enablers. She discovered that Dr. Peterson had falsified psychiatric evaluations for at least 12 women over the past 5 years. Judge Coleman had signed commitment orders and custody transfers without proper hearings. The corruption was systematic and well-funded. Madison also learned that she hadn't been Blake's only target. 2 other women had committed suicide after being treated by Dr. Peterson and appearing before Judge Coleman. Their husbands had walked away with inherited wealth totaling over $200 million. The breakthrough came when Madison tracked down Jennifer Walsh, one of Blake's previous victims who'd managed to escape before the final phase of his plan. Jennifer was living under an assumed name in Arizona, too terrified to come forward but willing to share her story with someone who'd survived the same ordeal. Blake's method is always the same, Jennifer explained during their encrypted video call. Isolate, gaslight, then trigger a crisis that justifies commitment or worse. But he makes one mistake every time. What's that? He documents everything. Blake's so convinced he's untouchable that he keeps records of all his schemes. Insurance, in case any of his partners try to betray him. Jennifer told Madison about a storage unit in San Jose where Blake kept his insurance files. Physical documents that couldn't be deleted or hacked. Evidence of every crime, every payoff, every conspiracy. Madison knew this was her chance, but getting into that storage facility would require resources she didn't have. More importantly, it would require taking a risk that could expose Justice to danger. That's when she received an unexpected message through the network's encrypted communication system. It was from Detective Ray Morgan. "Elena, I know who you really are." The message read, "And I know I made a terrible mistake. Blake isn't who I thought he was. I want to help you get your life back." Madison stared at the message for a long time. Ray had betrayed her once. Could she trust him again, or was this another trap Blake had set for her doctor? Vasquez advised caution. Ray could be working for Blake. This could be a way to flush you out. But Madison had an investigative journalist's instinct for reading people, and something in Ray's message felt genuine. More importantly, she needed law enforcement on her side if she was going to take down Blake's entire network. She agreed to meet Ray at a public location where she could disappear quickly if it was a trap. The meeting point was a farmer's market in Santa Rosa, crowded enough to provide cover, but open enough to spot surveillance. Ray looked haggard when she saw him, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. "Jesus, Madison, when I heard about the suicide, I knew something was wrong. Blake's reaction wasn't right. He was relieved, not devastated." Madison studied her former colleague's face, looking for signs of deception. She saw guilt, regret, and determination, but no hint that he was lying. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "Because I've been investigating Blake since you disappeared. And what I've found would make your old journalism professor proud." Ray had discovered financial connections between Blake and Dr. Peterson dating back 7 years. Shell companies that funded the psychiatrist's research. Payments disguised as consulting fees. A paper trail that proved their conspiracy was long-standing and well-organized. "I can't arrest Blake without more evidence," Ray explained. "But if you can get into that storage unit Jennifer told you about, we'll have everything we need." Madison felt hope and terror in equal measure. This could be her chance to destroy Blake and reclaim her life. Or it could be the mistake that got her and Justice killed. "What about my son?" she asked. "Leave him with the network for now. If this goes wrong, he'll be safer away from you." Madison knew Ray was right, but the thought of separating from Justice made her physically ill. She'd already lost so much to Blake's schemes. Could she risk losing her son too? That night, she held Justice close and made the hardest decision of her life. She would go after Blake, and she would either destroy him completely or die trying. Breaking into Blake's storage unit required military precision and a willingness to commit multiple felonies. Madison had spent weeks studying the facility's security, guard rotations, and camera blind spots. She'd practiced lockpicking until her fingers bled and studied the building's electrical systems like a master thief. The plan was set for a Tuesday night when the facility would be minimally staffed. Ray would create a distraction by investigating a suspicious vehicle in the parking lot, drawing the security guard away from the monitor station. Madison would have exactly 12 minutes to get in, photograph Blake's documents, and get out. But as Madison crouched in the shadows outside Secure Storage Solutions, watching Ray approach the guard shack, her phone buzzed with a message that changed everything. "We have your son," the text read. "Storage Unit 247. Come alone, or the baby dies." Madison's blood turned to ice. The message came from Blake's number. He'd found Justice and the safe house. The network that had protected her for months had been compromised. For a moment, Madison considered running. Blake wanted her dead anyway. If she disappeared completely, maybe he'd leave Justice alone, raise him as his own son. But Madison knew Blake too well. Her son was just another asset to be exploited. Blake would never love Justice the way a father should. Madison texted Ray, "Abort, it's a trap." Then she walked into the storage facility through the front door. The guard barely looked up from his magazine as Madison signed in using fake credentials. Blake had taught her that the best way to be invisible was to act like you belonged. She walked calmly to Unit 247, her heart hammering with every step. The unit door was slightly open. Madison could hear Justice crying inside. "Hello, Madison!" Blake stepped out of the shadows, holding Justice in his arms. Or should I say Elena, very creative? By the way, I almost didn't recognize you with the short hair. Madison forced herself to stay calm. Blake fed on fear and desperation. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Let me hold my son," she said quietly. "Our son," Blake corrected. "And I don't think that's a good idea. You're supposed to be dead. Remember, a dead woman can't exactly file for custody." Madison could see Scarlett in the background, along with two men she didn't recognize. Blake had brought muscle, which meant he was taking her seriously as a threat. "What do you want?" Madison asked. "I want you to disappear for real this time. No more underground networks. No more fake identities. No more investigations. You're going to walk out of here tonight and never contact our son again. And if I refuse," Blake's smile was cold, "then Justice grows up in foster care while you rot in prison for faking your own death and insurance fraud. Your choice." Madison realized Blake had orchestrated this perfectly. He'd used Justice as bait to draw her out, but he'd also created a scenario where she couldn't win. If she tried to expose him now, she'd be arrested for the crimes she'd committed while trying to survive his conspiracy. But Blake had made one crucial mistake. He'd brought Madison to his storage unit, the place where he kept evidence of all his crimes. Madison had spent years learning to think several moves ahead during her investigations. While Blake talked, she was studying the unit's contents: file boxes, computer equipment, and a safe that was currently open, probably because Blake had been accessing documents to frame her for additional crimes. "I need proof that Justice will be safe," Madison said, buying time. "You'll have to trust me on that," Madison almost laughed. "Trust Blake, the man who'd built their entire marriage on lies." "Let me say goodbye to him at least," she said. Blake hesitated, then stepped closer. The moment Madison took Justice in her arms, she saw her opportunity. The open safe was 3 feet away. Blake's phone was on the counter next to it, probably containing the evidence he'd used to track down the safe house. Madison kissed Justice's forehead and whispered, "Mama loves you, baby. I'm going to fix this." Then she handed Justice back to Blake and moved as if to leave. Instead, she grabbed Blake's phone and dove behind the file boxes. "Stop her!" Blake shouted. The two men Blake had brought lunged toward Madison, but she was already accessing the phone's camera and photographing everything in the open safe: financial records, emails, photographs, legal documents, years of evidence documenting Blake's conspiracy. Blake grabbed her arm, but Madison had uploaded the photos to a cloud storage account linked to Ray's email. Even if Blake destroyed his phone, the evidence would survive. "You stupid bitch," Blake snarled. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I've just destroyed you," Madison replied calmly. That's when they heard the sirens. Ray had received Madison's uploaded evidence and called for backup. Police cars surrounded the storage facility, and officers were already moving through the building. Blake's face went white. "You set me up." "I learned from the best," Madison said, but Blake wasn't finished. In a final desperate move, he grabbed Justice and backed toward the unit's rear wall. "Nobody moves or the baby gets hurt," he said. Madison felt the world collapse around her. Blake was trapped, cornered, and desperate. Men like him did unpredictable things when they had nothing left to lose. "Blake, please," she said. "He's your son, too." "He's a means to an end," Blake replied. "He always was." The police were at the unit's entrance now, but they couldn't risk Justice's safety by storming in. Blake held all the cards again. That's when Scarlett Hayes made the decision that changed everything. "Blake, stop," she said quietly. "It's over." "Shut up, Scarlett. We can still get out of this." "No, we can't. And I'm not going to prison for you." Scarlett stepped between Blake and the exit. "Give Madison her baby." Blake stared at his former partner in shock. "You're betraying me after everything we planned together. I signed up to steal money, not hurt children." The momentary distraction was all Madison needed. She lunged forward and grabbed Justice from Blake's arms. As she pulled her son to safety, Scarlett knocked Blake off balance, and the police moved in. Blake Sullivan was finally under arrest, but as Madison held Justice close, listening to Blake scream about conspiracy and injustice, she realized the hardest part was still ahead. Blake was caught, but his network of corruption was still intact, and Madison was still legally dead. Getting her life back would require one final gambit. The legal resurrection of Madison Sullivan required a combination of legal maneuvering, media strategy, and sheer audacity that would have impressed her journalism professors. Working with a team of attorneys provided by the Underground Network, Madison prepared to emerge from the dead in the most public way possible. The plan was to turn Blake's own methods against him. He'd used media manipulation and public sympathy to control the narrative around Madison's disappearance. Now she would use those same tools to expose his crimes and reclaim her identity. The timing had to be perfect. Blake was in custody, but his lawyers were already working on damage control. Dr. Peterson had fled the country. Judge Coleman was claiming ignorance about any conspiracy. If Madison waited too long, Blake's network would regroup and she'd be painted as a criminal who'd faked her own death. Ray Morgan had become Madison's strongest ally within law enforcement. The evidence from Blake's storage unit was overwhelming, but proving the extent of the conspiracy would take months. In the meantime, Madison needed to establish her legal status and protect justice from Blake's remaining allies. "We're going to hold a press conference," Madison's lead attorney, Catherine Webb, explained. "You're going to tell your story publicly, all at once, before Blake's people can spin it." The press conference was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at the San Francisco Press Club. Madison had chosen the location deliberately. It was where she'd broken her biggest investigative stories as a journalist. Now she would become the story. The night before the press conference, Madison sat in a hotel room with Justice, preparing for the most important performance of her life. She'd practiced her statement dozens of times, but her hands still shook as she held the pages. Justice crawled across the hotel bed, babbling happily and reaching for her notes. At 8 months old, he had no idea that his father was a criminal or that his mother had been legally dead for 4 months. To him, this was just another day in a life that had been chaotic since birth. "Tomorrow, baby boy, we're going to get our life back," Madison whispered to him. The press conference room was packed. Madison recognized reporters from every major news outlet in California, plus national correspondents who'd flown in to cover the story. The dead wife of tech mogul Blake Sullivan was about to rise from the grave, and everyone wanted the exclusive. Madison walked to the podium carrying Justice, who looked around at the cameras with curious eyes. She'd dressed professionally but not expensively, projecting competence without suggesting she'd been living luxuriously while supposedly dead. "My name is Madison Sullivan," she began. "4 months ago, you were told that I committed suicide by driving off a cliff near Big Sur. That was a lie. I am very much alive, and I'm here to tell you the truth about what really happened." For the next 30 minutes, Madison laid out Blake's conspiracy with the precision of the investigative journalist she'd once been. She presented financial evidence, medical records, recordings, and testimony from other victims. She explained the underground network that had saved her life and the legal challenges she'd faced as a woman with no official identity. The room was completely silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratching of pens on notepads. When Madison finished her statement, the questions came like an avalanche. "Mrs. Sullivan, why didn't you contact authorities instead of faking your death?" "Because the authorities were compromised. Dr. Peterson, who evaluated me, was taking payments from my husband. Judge Coleman, who would have heard my case, was part of the conspiracy. I had no choice but to disappear to protect myself and my son." "How do you respond to charges that you committed fraud by faking your death?" "I committed no fraud. I took no insurance money, filed no false claims, and stole nothing from anyone. I simply disappeared to survive a conspiracy to steal my inheritance and take my child." "What evidence do you have of your husband's crimes?" Madison gestured to the boxes of documents her legal team had arranged on tables around the room. "Everything is here. Financial records, emails, recordings, witness testimony. My husband documented his own crimes because he never believed he'd be caught." The most important question came from Rebecca Chen, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle who'd covered several of Madison's investigative pieces years earlier. Madison, what do you want people to understand about what happened to you? Madison looked directly into the cameras, knowing that Blake would be watching from his jail cell. I want people to understand that the systems meant to protect vulnerable people can be corrupted, that wealthy men with the right connections can make innocent women disappear, and that sometimes the only way to get justice is to be willing to sacrifice everything, including your own identity, to expose the truth. The press conference was carried live on social media and news networks across the country. Within hours, Justice for Madison was trending on Twitter. Blake's mugshot was being shared alongside photos of his luxury lifestyle, creating a stark contrast that played perfectly in Madison's favor. But the real victory came that evening, when Madison received a call from District Attorney Sarah Fitzgerald. Ms. Sullivan, I've reviewed the evidence you provided. We're prepared to offer you full immunity in exchange for your cooperation in prosecuting not just your husband, but his entire network. Madison closed her eyes and felt years of tension leave her body. What about my son? Full custody, retroactive to his birth. Blake Sullivan will never have legal rights to that child. That night, Madison held Justice in their hotel room and called Dr. Vasquez. It's over, she said. We won. No, Dr. Vasquez replied. You won, and you saved a lot of other women in the process. Madison looked at her son, who was chewing on a toy and grinning at her with Blake's eyes but her own stubborn determination. What do you think, Justice, ready to start our real life? But even as Madison celebrated, she knew Blake would have one final card to play. Men like him didn't go down without a fight. Blake Sullivan's trial became the media sensation of the year, dubbed the Vanishing Wife case by journalists who couldn't resist the dramatic narrative. Madison testified for 3 days, walking the jury through Blake's conspiracy with the methodical precision that had made her a respected investigative journalist. Blake's defense team tried every angle they could find. They painted Madison as a mentally unstable woman who'd had a psychotic break during pregnancy. They claimed Blake was the real victim, a loving husband whose wife had disappeared and traumatized him. They suggested Madison had orchestrated the entire situation for attention and money. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the documentation too thorough. Blake's own emails and recordings destroyed every lie his lawyers tried to construct. But Blake saved his most devastating move for last. On the final day of testimony, Blake's lawyer called an unexpected witness, Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric psychiatrist who'd examined Justice while Blake had custody. Dr. Foster, the defense attorney said, in your professional opinion, is Justice Sullivan safe with his mother? Madison's blood ran cold. She hadn't been allowed to see Dr. Foster's report, and the psychiatrist's expression suggested bad news. Based on my evaluation, Dr. Foster said, I have serious concerns about Madison Sullivan's fitness as a mother. Her decision to fake her own death and expose her infant to an unstable lifestyle shows poor judgment and potential mental illness. Madison watched the jury's faces change. Even though Blake was clearly guilty of fraud and conspiracy, his lawyer was planting doubt about Madison's character. If she couldn't provide a stable home for Justice, maybe Blake's crimes were secondary to the child's welfare. Catherine Webb, Madison's attorney, fought back during cross-examination. Dr. Foster, are you aware that Madison Sullivan was fleeing a conspiracy to kidnap her child and steal her inheritance? I understand that's her claim. Yes. And you're aware that this conspiracy has been proven through financial records, recordings, and testimony from multiple witnesses. I'm aware of the allegations. So in your professional opinion, a mother who takes extraordinary measures to protect her child from kidnapping is mentally unfit. Dr. Foster hesitated. The methods she chose were extreme and potentially harmful to the child. More harmful than leaving the child with a father who planned to steal his inheritance and possibly kill his mother. That's not for me to determine. Madison could see the jury was confused. Blake's crimes were obvious, but his lawyer had successfully muddied the waters around Madison's fitness as a mother. When court recessed for the day, Catherine pulled Madison aside. They're going to recommend that Justice be placed in foster care pending a separate custody hearing, she said. Blake's lawyer is arguing that both parents are unfit. Madison felt her world crumbling again. She'd fought so hard to protect justice, only to have the legal system take him away anyway. That night, Madison sat in her hotel room staring at legal documents and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe she should have stayed dead. Maybe justice would have been better off with Blake. Even if Blake was a criminal, at least he would have grown up wealthy and safe. The self-doubt was overwhelming. Madison had sacrificed everything to get to this moment, and she was about to lose anyway. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Vasquez. "Madison, I'm watching the trial coverage. You look like you're giving up." "Maybe I should. Maybe Blake was right. Maybe I am mentally unstable. What kind of mother fakes her own death? The kind who's willing to die to save her child. Madison, listen to me. You're not crazy. You're not unfit. You're a warrior who fought an entire corrupt system and won. It doesn't feel like winning, because it's not over yet. Blake has one more move, and so do you." Dr. Vasquez was right. Madison had spent so much time reacting to Blake's schemes that she'd forgotten her greatest strength. She wasn't just a victim or a mother or a woman fighting for justice. She was an investigative journalist, and she still had one story left to tell. Madison spent the night researching Dr. Amanda Foster. By morning, she'd discovered that Dr. Foster had financial connections to the same shell companies that had funded Dr. Peterson's research. Blake's corruption network was even larger than anyone had realized. When court reconvened, Madison passed a note to Catherine. Her attorney read it, smiled, and requested permission to recall Dr. Foster for additional questions. "Dr. Rav Foster," Catherine said, "are you familiar with Riverside Medical Research?" Dr. Foster's confident expression wavered. "Yes, it's a research foundation. A foundation that's paid you over $200,000 in consulting fees over the past 3 years. I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because Riverside Medical Research is a shell company owned by Blake Sullivan. You've been taking money from the defendant while evaluating his wife's fitness as a mother." The courtroom erupted. Blake's lawyer objected furiously, but the damage was done. Madison had exposed Blake's network one final time, proving that his corruption extended even into the custody evaluation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Blake Sullivan was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Dr. Peterson, Dr. Foster, and Judge Coleman were arrested based on evidence uncovered during the trial. The entire network that had enabled Blake's crimes was dismantled, and Madison was awarded full custody of justice, with the court formally apologizing for the trauma she'd endured while seeking protection from a corrupt system. As Madison walked out of the courthouse with justice in her arms, reporters shouted questions about her plans for the future. Madison stopped at the courthouse steps and looked back at the building where she'd finally gotten justice. "I'm going home," she said simply. But as she spoke those words, Madison realized she had no idea where home was anymore. The penthouse belonged to her past life. The safe house was temporary. The underground network had served its purpose. For the first time since this nightmare began, Madison was truly free to choose her own path. 2 years after Blake's conviction, Madison stood on the deck of her cottage overlooking the Oregon coast, watching justice take his first steps across the weathered wooden planks. At 2 years old, he was fearless, stubborn, and absolutely determined to explore every inch of his world. Madison had chosen Cannon Beach for their new home, drawn by the endless horizon and the sound of waves that drowned out the noise of her past. She'd bought the cottage with money from the civil judgment against Blake, who'd been forced to pay restitution for the inheritance he'd tried to steal. The cottage was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where Madison could see the ocean while making Justice's breakfast, and a study where she'd built her new career. Madison Sullivan, the trophy wife, was gone forever. In her place was Madison Cross, the investigative journalist who'd become one of the most sought-after experts on domestic abuse and financial fraud. Her book, Vanishing Point: How I Disappeared to Save My Life, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The documentary based on her story had won an Emmy, but more importantly, the Madison Cross Foundation had helped over 300 women escape situations similar to what she'd endured. Dr. Vasquez ran the foundation's Safe House network, which had expanded to 12 states. Detective Ray Morgan headed the law enforcement training program that taught police officers to recognize sophisticated domestic abuse schemes. Even Scarlett Hayes, who'd served 18 months for her role in Blake's conspiracy, now worked as a counselor helping other women recognize the warning signs of manipulation. Madison's phone rang as she watched Justice chase seagulls across the sand. The caller ID showed Catherine Webb, her former attorney who'd become a close friend. "Madison, you need to see the news. Blake's appealing his conviction." Madison felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it passed quickly. "On what grounds?" "His new lawyer is claiming that your testimony was fraudulent because you were using a false identity when you investigated him." Madison laughed, surprising herself. 2 years ago, news of Blake's legal maneuvering would have sent her into a panic. Now it just seemed pathetic. "Catherine, we documented everything. The appeals court isn't going to overturn a conviction based on Blake's lawyer grasping at straws." "I know. I just wanted to warn you in case reporters start calling." "Let them call. I'm not hiding anymore." After hanging up, Madison realized how far she'd come. Blake had once been the center of her universe, first as a husband she'd loved, then as an enemy she'd feared. Now he was just a criminal in prison, getting older and more irrelevant with each passing day. Justice toddled back to the deck, sandy and grinning, holding a shell he'd discovered. "Mama, look," he said, his vocabulary expanding daily. Madison knelt to examine his treasure. "That's beautiful, baby. Should we add it to our collection?" Their cottage was filled with shells, rocks, and pieces of driftwood that Justice collected during their daily beach walks. Madison had initially tried to limit the clutter, but she'd come to love these reminders of their simple, honest life. That evening, after Justice was asleep, Madison sat at her computer working on her second book. This one would focus on the systemic changes needed to prevent predators like Blake from exploiting vulnerable women. She'd interviewed dozens of experts, survivors, and law enforcement officials. An email notification popped up on her screen. The subject line made her smile. "Speaking opportunity, Harvard Law School." Harvard wanted Madison to deliver the keynote address at their symposium on domestic violence and financial abuse. The invitation was signed by Dean Patricia Coleman, who'd apparently rebuilt her career after serving her sentence for judicial corruption. Madison stared at the email for a long time. Patricia Coleman was one of the people who'd enabled Blake's crimes. She'd signed the commitment orders that had trapped Madison in the psychiatric hospital. Now she wanted Madison to speak at Harvard. Madison's first instinct was to delete the email, but then she thought about the students who would attend the symposium, young lawyers who might one day represent women like her, prosecutors who might face cases involving financial abuse, judges who would decide custody cases. Madison began typing her response. "Dean Coleman, I accept your invitation. However, I have one condition. I want to address not just the legal aspects of domestic abuse, but the institutional failures that enable it. I want to talk about judges who sign orders without proper hearings, doctors who falsify evaluations for money, and law enforcement officers who dismiss women's concerns as hysteria. If you're willing to let me tell that story, I'll be there." The response came within an hour. "Mr. Cross, that's exactly the conversation we need to have." Madison closed her laptop and walked out onto the deck. The Oregon coast was magnificent at night, with stars reflecting off the dark water and the rhythmic sound of waves creating a natural symphony. She thought about Blake, probably lying on a narrow prison bunk, surrounded by concrete walls instead of ocean views. She thought about the life they'd planned together, built on lies and manipulation. And she thought about the life she'd built for herself in Justice, founded on truth and hard-won freedom. Madison had learned that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to be willing to lose everything. She'd given up her identity, her security, her legal existence, and nearly her son to escape Blake's trap. But in losing everything, she'd found something more valuable than the wealth Blake had tried to steal. She'd found herself. Justice stirred in his crib, making the soft sounds that meant he was having happy dreams. Madison checked on him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Sweet dreams, baby," she whispered. "Tomorrow we'll find more shells." As Madison settled into her own bed, listening to the eternal conversation between wind and waves, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. The future stretched ahead of them like the endless horizon visible from their cottage windows. Blake had tried to erase her, but Madison had become more herself than ever before. She was no longer the woman who'd been afraid to question her husband's lies or trust her own instincts. She was the woman who'd rebuilt her life from nothing, who'd turned her trauma into purpose, who'd shown her son that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. In the morning, they would walk on the beach again. Justice would find new treasures, and Madison would continue writing the story of their triumph. But tonight, for the first time in years, Madison fell asleep without checking the locks on her doors or worrying about who might be hunting her. She was finally, completely, home. Epilogue 5 years later, Madison received a letter forwarded through her publisher. The return address was a federal prison in Texas. Blake had written to her from his cell. Madison almost threw the letter away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of her. Blake's handwriting was still precise, still confident despite his circumstances. Madison, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you. Prison has given me time to think about the man I became and the pain I caused. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to, but I want you to know that Justice is lucky to have you as his mother. You saved him from becoming someone like me. Madison read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. Blake had become what he'd always been irrelevant to her real life. That afternoon, she and 7-year-old Justice walked their familiar beach, collecting shells and talking about his day at school. Justice was everything Blake wasn't: honest, kind, curious about the world around him. He knew his father was in prison, but Madison had never told him the details. That would be Justice's choice when he was old enough to understand. Mama, Justice said as they reached their favorite tide pool, tell me again about the time you disappeared. Madison smiled. Justice loved her stories, especially the one about the brave woman who vanished to save her baby and came back stronger than ever. Once upon a time, Madison began, there was a woman who thought she was trapped, but she learned that sometimes, when you disappear completely, you can become exactly who you were meant to be. Justice nodded solemnly, as if he understood the deeper meaning. Maybe he did. Maybe growing up with a mother who'd fought for their freedom had taught him lessons about courage that most children never learned. As they walked home along the beach, Madison realized that Blake's letter had been one final gift, not because of what he'd written, but because of what she'd felt reading it. Nothing. Blake Sullivan no longer had the power to hurt her, to frighten her, or even to make her angry. He was just a man in a cage, while she was free under an infinite sky. Madison had won more completely than she'd ever dared to dream. The end. Total word count 9, 487 words.